She was 84 years old. She had lived in the same house for more than 5 decades. She went to church every Sunday without fail. She played card games with her grandchildren on Friday nights. And on the night of January 31st, 2026, her son-in-law Tommaso Cioni dropped her off at home, watched the garage door close behind her, and drove away. By 2:30 the following morning, she was gone. No emergency call, no alarm triggered, no neighbor who heard anything unusual cut through the desert silence of the Catalina foothills. Just a sequence of timestamps, a camera, a pacemaker, a phone that told a story investigators are still working to fully unravel. And somewhere inside that sequence, compressed into a narrow window of minutes in the early hours of February 1st, 2026, a masked figure stood on the front porch of Nancy Guthrie's home and made a series of decisions that the FBI now believes were not made that night at all. They were made days, possibly weeks, before he ever arrived. This is not a story about a missing elderly woman in the desert. That is the surface. That is what the headlines gave you. What the evidence actually shows, what 4 named FBI experts have independently concluded, what the forensic architecture of this crime makes structurally impossible to ignore, is something far more targeted. Someone did not come to that house because of Nancy Guthrie. Someone came to that house because of who Nancy Guthrie's daughter is, because of what that daughter built over 20 years at the top of American media, and because the most effective way to destroy someone with power, with lawyers, with resources, and with security is not to go after them directly. It is to go after the person they love most, the person who has none of those protections, the 84-year-old woman living alone in the desert who never saw it coming. Before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, right now is the moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. This channel covers the Nancy Guthrie case with verified sourcing and named expert analysis only. No speculation packaged as fact. No recycled headlines. What you are about to hear has been assembled carefully, and there is significantly more coming. Hit subscribe so you do not miss a single update. Now, back to January 31st. The day started the way Nancy Guthrie's Fridays typically started. At 5:32 in the afternoon, she took an Uber from her Catalina foothills home to the nearby residence of her daughter Annie and son-in-law Tommaso Cioni. Dinner, card games, the kind of evening that had become a fixed point in her weekly routine. She was in good spirits. She was, by every account produced by everyone who saw her that day, entirely herself. Sharp, engaged, present. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos would later state publicly, without qualification, that Nancy Guthrie had no cognitive decline. She knew who she was. She knew where she was. She knew her life. At approximately 9:48 that evening, Tommaso Cioni drove her home. He dropped her off. The garage door opened. It closed, and Nancy Guthrie walked into the house she had lived in for over 50 years, in the Catalina foothills neighborhood north of Tucson, Arizona. And that was the last confirmed moment anyone in her family saw her. What happened in the hours that followed is a forensic sequence that investigators have reconstructed from fragments. At 2:12 in the morning, the motion detection on Nancy's Nest doorbell camera registered activity at the front of the property. Here is the detail that matters, and that almost no one covering this case has properly explained. Nancy's Nest camera did not have an active storage subscription. That means the footage was not automatically saved to the cloud. The camera detected motion. It logged a timestamp. The continuous recording did not survive. What the FBI and Pima County investigators were ultimately able to recover through work with technical partners were still images, fragments, pieces of a sequence without a confirmed continuous record. Those images, released publicly on February 10, 2026 by FBI Director Kash Patel, show a masked individual on Nancy Guthrie's property. Dark clothing, a ski mask, black gloves, a backpack, a firearm in a holster worn at the front of the body. Investigators estimated his height at between 5 feet 9 inches and 5 feet 10 inches. And in the recovered images, the suspect appears to be actively interfering with the camera, reaching toward it, then positioning branches from nearby vegetation across the lens. At 2:30 in the morning, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker completed its final sync with her Apple devices. Understand what that means. A pacemaker application does not go silent randomly. It goes silent when the device moves beyond Bluetooth range of its paired phone. And it goes silent when the physical connection between the device and the phone it monitors is broken by distance. 18 minutes between the camera detecting movement on that porch and the cardiac monitoring application transmitting its last signal. 18 minutes that the FBI has been working backward through since the first hour of this investigation. At 11:56 that Sunday morning, Nancy's family tried to reach her. She had not appeared for her virtual church service. She never missed it. The calls went unanswered. Family members went to the house. And what they found when they arrived, her purse left inside, her phone left inside, her wallet left inside, her car still in the garage, told them immediately that Nancy Guthrie had not left of her own accord. The Pima County Sheriff's Department was contacted. Investigators arrived. Now, and when they reached the front porch of that house, they found biological traces near the front entrance and down the driveway that caused Sheriff Chris Nanos to reclassify this case within hours from a missing persons report to a criminal investigation. Homicide investigators were brought in. The FBI arrived. And the evidence recovered inside that residence, evidence authorities have not disclosed in full, was significant enough that the sheriff stated publicly and without hesitation that Nancy Guthrie had been taken against her will. Ask yourself what that determination requires. Law enforcement does not involve federal resources, homicide investigators, and a full task force on instinct alone. Something inside that house told them this was not a woman who walked away. If something told them the clock on finding Nancy Guthrie safely was running, and that every hour mattered. Then, on February 2nd, a ransom demand arrived at KOLD-TV, the CBS affiliate in Tucson. It contained specific details about Nancy's home, specific details about the clothing she had been wearing the night Tommaso Cioni dropped her off. Details that a speculative letter writer composing fiction would not have access to. The demand was set at $6 million, payable in Bitcoin, and it was not sent to the family through a private channel designed for quiet negotiation. It was sent to a media outlet, designed for public exposure, the kind of strategic media targeting that only makes operational sense if the goal is not simply extraction, but public pain. Visible, documented, broadcast pain directed at a specific person. A Savannah Guthrie earns between $8 million and $24 million annually. Her estimated net worth is approximately $40 million. The $6 million figure was not calibrated to the modest assets of a retired university clerk in the Catalina foothills. It was calibrated to the financial profile of the most famous person in that family. And that calibration is not coincidence. It is intent. It is the fingerprint of someone who had studied Savannah Guthrie's life, her finances, her schedule, and her vulnerabilities long before January 31st ever arrived. Because here is the detail that expands the scope of this entire investigation. Investigators working the case have been asking neighbors in the Catalina foothills for security camera footage, specifically from January 24th, 2026, and a full week before the motion detection event, a full week before the pacemaker went silent. Someone was present in that neighborhood 7 days before Nancy disappeared, watching the property, mapping the layout, learning the rhythms of a house where an 84-year-old woman lived alone. The operation that unfolded in the early hours of February 1st was not improvised. It was the culmination of surveillance, of planning, of a patience that makes this crime more calculated and more personal than almost any coverage of it has been willing to say directly. Nancy Guthrie was not a target of opportunity. She was a target of design, and the design was built around her daughter. In the next chapter, the 25-year FBI veteran who analyzed the images of that masked figure and identified the single behavioral detail that every other analyst missed is going to tell you exactly what that suspect's movements reveal, and why what he saw points directly toward someone who may have expected Nancy Guthrie to open that door willingly. Not every person who appears on television after a high-profile case actually knows what they are looking at. Some are former law enforcement who left the field a decade ago and now trade on a title. Some are commentators with a microphone and an opinion. Some have studied violent crime from inside a classroom but have never stood at the edge of a real scene and felt the particular weight of what an unsolved case actually demands. The cable news ecosystem runs on all of them. They fill airtime, and they generate reaction. And in a case like this one, they can send the public chasing in entirely the wrong direction. Johnny Grusing is not any of those people. He spent 25 years inside the FBI's Denver division, not in administration, not in public affairs, as an investigator, violent crimes, missing persons, serial offenders. For 13 of those 25 years, he coordinated the division's behavioral analysis unit, the unit specifically built to read the psychology of subjects from the evidence they leave behind. He wrote a book about catching a serial killer. He is not performing analysis for a segment. When Johnny Grusing looks at footage from a crime scene, he is doing what he has done professionally for a quarter century. He is reading behavior. He is reconstructing intention from movement. Or he is working backward from what a person did to understand what that person was thinking before they did it. On February 22, 2026, Grusing spoke to Fox News Digital. He had studied the doorbell camera footage the FBI released 12 days earlier. And what he said in that interview did not simply add a new layer to the investigation, it restructured the foundation of it. Here is what the footage actually shows. At 1:47 a.m. on February 1st, Nancy's Nest doorbell camera disconnected. Not triggered by motion, not jammed by interference. Disconnected. 25 minutes later, at 2:12 a.m., a separate security camera on the property detected motion at the front of the house. And that gap, 25 minutes between the doorbell going dark and the next camera registering movement, is a window investigators have been examining with granular precision. Because something happened in that window. And the images recovered from the period surrounding that motion detection event are what Johnny Grusing spent weeks analyzing. Everyone else who looked at those images focused on the physical description of the suspect. The dark jacket, the ski mask, the gloves, the backpack, the approximate height. These are surface details, useful for identification after you already know who you are looking for. What Grusing focused on was different. He focused on the sequence of the suspect's movements, specifically what the suspect did with his hands in the first moments of his approach to the front of the property. And Grusing described it with precision. The suspect reached toward the camera with his gloved right hand. The motion did not appear to be an attempt to remove the device. It appeared to be an attempt to cover the lens. Then the suspect looked down. He looked around. He located branches from the front garden. He lifted them and positioned them in front of the camera. Deliberately, without urgency, with the measured calm of someone who had thought through this specific moment before arriving at it. That sequence told Gruesing something that reframed the entire crime. You do not cover a camera to hide from investigators pulling footage after the fact. Investigators will access whatever data exists regardless. You cover a camera because there is a screen inside the house connected to that camera. Oh, and you do not want the person inside to look at that screen and see a masked face before they decide whether to open the door. Because that is Gruesing's next conclusion, and it is the one that stops this case cold. He raised the possibility, supported directly by the behavioral evidence in the footage, that the suspect did not force his way into Nancy Guthrie's home at all. He may have knocked on her door. He may have pressed the doorbell. He may have stood on that porch at 2 in the morning and waited for an 84-year-old woman to come to him willingly. Sit with that, because it changes the entire character of this crime. Forcing entry is a stranger act. You do not need a relationship to defeat a lock, but knocking on a door in the middle of the night and expecting it to open, that requires something no stranger possesses. And it requires the reasonable expectation that the person inside might recognize your voice, that they might hear something familiar enough, something trusted enough on the other side of that door to override every instinct telling an elderly woman alone in her house to stay inside. You do not knock on a stranger's door at 2 in the morning expecting a response. You knock on the door of someone who knows you, or someone connected to someone you both know. That single behavioral inference, drawn from recovered images by a man who spent 13 years running the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, pivots the entire investigation from the exterior of a crime to the interior of a relationship. Gruesing went further. He analyzed the suspect's firearm, though carried in what appeared to be an inexpensive holster worn at the front of the body. A configuration Gruesing described plainly as not tactically sound. Combined with the thick gloves visible in the footage, Gruesing assessed that operating the weapon effectively would have been extremely difficult. His conclusion was direct. The firearm was in all likelihood not an operational instrument. It was a compliance tool, carried to produce fear, to produce cooperation. Gruesing's exact framing. The gun was likely a prop. This is the behavioral profile of someone who came to that porch to manage a situation, not to initiate a confrontation. Someone who had mapped the psychological mechanics of the encounter before arriving. Someone who understood that a firearm, even one that was never going to be discharged, too would be enough to produce compliance from an elderly woman alone in the dark. And then Gruesing made the observation that connects every thread in this case. He said he has always believed that during the interaction between the suspect and Nancy Guthrie, something went wrong, something unplanned, something that forced the situation to escalate beyond whatever the original intent had been. His specific theory: Nancy may have identified the person in front of her. She may have said something, a name, a recognition, and that moment of identification caused a panic the suspect had not prepared for. The original plan collapsed. Removing Nancy from the property became not the goal of the operation, but the consequence of its failure. He was not there to take her. He was there for something else. And when Nancy recognized him, taking her became the only available response. Gruesing was also direct about the ransom theory, and he does not buy it. The alleged kidnappers never contacted the Guthrie family directly. The demands went to a television station, to TMZ, not to the people with the resources to pay. That is not how a professional ransom operation runs. That is how someone performs a grievance on a public stage. He also made one more observation that the behavioral science behind this case demands you pay attention to. He said the suspect is not a professional. Look at the awkwardness of the approach, the amateurish handling of the camera obstruction, the cheap holster, the gloves that compromise the very weapon he is carrying. This is someone who prepared emotionally for this operation far more than they prepared tactically. Someone driven by something powerful enough to override caution, override logic, see too, and override the enormous risk of targeting a woman in her own home in a residential neighborhood in the middle of the night. That kind of override does not come from financial calculation alone. It comes from something personal, something that has been building, something that, according to Gruesing, was strong enough that this person was willing to walk up to a porch at 2 in the morning with a prop firearm and knock on the door, because they needed to confront someone, because they believed, in whatever framework they were operating inside, that they had been wronged. 4 named experts have now independently arrived at the same place. Former FBI profiler Jim Fitzgerald, obsession, financial motive, or revenge. A former FBI profiler, Jim Clemente. The interior timeline of the incident suggests the removal of Nancy was not the primary objective. Something inside that house changed the plan. Former homicide detective Ted Williams, the suspect's knowledge of the property indicates prior legitimate presence on the premises. And Johnny Gruesing, personal grievance. A confrontation. A plan that came apart the moment Nancy Guthrie looked at the person standing in front of her. Ask yourself what kind of grievance is strong enough to send someone to a porch in the desert at 2 in the morning with a prop firearm, and a plan that required an 84-year-old woman to open her own door. What kind of anger does not fade? What kind of injury does not heal? What kind of person spends weeks surveilling a property, mapping a timeline, calculating a salary range down to the bracket, and then gets it all wrong the moment the door opens because the one variable they did not account for was that she would recognize them? That question does not lead back to Nancy Guthrie. It never did. It leads back to 20 years of television, to a career built at the intersection of media, politics, money, and influence, to a woman who has spent 2 decades asking the questions that powerful people do not want asked, in front of audiences that powerful people cannot ignore. And in the next chapter, we are going to build the full picture of exactly who Nancy Guthrie was. Because understanding what she was not is the only way to understand why, out of every possible target, someone chose her. Before anyone can understand why Nancy Guthrie was taken, they have to understand who she actually was. Not the headline version, not the supporting character in her daughter's story, the full picture. Because the full picture is what makes the forensic conclusion of this case so impossible to argue with. Nancy Ellen Long was born on January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky, a small community just across the Ohio River from Cincinnati. She attended Catholic all-girls schools. She studied at the University of Kentucky, where she worked on the student newspaper as a society editor. She was sharp, socially engaged, and by every account people who knew her have given, someone who moved through the world with a specific kind of quiet authority, the kind that does not announce itself. She met Charles Guthrie on a blind date. She looked at him standing at the door of her sorority and, by the story Savannah has told on television more than once, Nancy said to herself, "That is the man I am going to marry." She was right. They wed on December 28, 1963. Charles was a mining engineer. His work took the family around the world, including a stint in Melbourne, Australia, where Savannah was born in 1971. 2 years later, the family settled in the Catalina foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona. and Nancy Guthrie never left. She raised 3 children in that neighborhood. She watched them grow up in the desert heat. She went to church every Sunday. She built a life that was, in every measurable sense, rooted, stable, private, ordinary in the best possible way. Then, June 10th, 1988 arrived. Charles Guthrie died suddenly of a cardiac event while on a mining trip in Mexico. He was 49 years old. Nancy was 46. Savannah was 16 and about to begin her senior year of high school. There was no warning, no preparation, no financial cushion sufficient for a family that had been built around a 2-income structure. In a single day, Nancy Guthrie went from wife and full-time mother to sole provider for 3 children in a house in the desert with no blueprint for what came next. What she did next is the detail that tells you everything about who she was. She went to work, not for herself, for them. Nancy took a position in public relations at the University of Arizona, specifically according to Savannah in a 2016 Hollywood Reporter interview, so that her daughters could attend the university tuition-free. She structured her own professional life around their futures. She started in 1990. She stayed until 2007. 17 years. And during that time, she served as coordinator of the Center Stage program, a musical performance series for hospital staff and patients. She served as program director for MedCamp, a program introducing Arizona high school students to careers in medicine. And in 2000, her colleagues elected her president of the Southern Arizona chapter of the Public Relations Society of America. That is not a title given to someone people merely tolerated. That is a title given to someone people respected. Her children built their lives on the foundation she provided. Her son Cameron became a colonel and flew F-16S for 26 years in the Vermont Air National Guard. Her daughter Annie became a poet, a jeweler, and a creative writing teacher at the University of Arizona Poetry Center. And Savannah, the youngest, became one of the most recognized broadcast journalists in the country. Nancy encouraged all of it. Savannah has said publicly and repeatedly that it was her mother who pushed her toward journalism, who saw something in her youngest child before anyone else did, who kept pushing even when the path was uncertain. After she retired from the University of Arizona in 2007, Nancy returned to the life she had always preferred: quiet, faithful, present. She attended St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Tucson and later services at another local congregation. She played cards with her grandchildren on Friday nights at Annie and Tommaso Cioni's home. She appeared on the Today Show occasionally, sitting beside her daughter on television, always warmly received by the audience that watched Savannah every morning. See, in a 2022 broadcast celebrating Nancy's 80th birthday, Savannah described her mother on air. She said her mother was quick, smart, well-read, and curious about everything. She was, Savannah said, the rock that held the family together after her father died, the woman who met every hard thing life delivered without self-pity, with determination, and with what Savannah called unshakable faith. Now hold all of that. Hold the full weight of who this woman was, and then ask yourself the question that investigators ask themselves within the first 24 hours of this case. Who had a grievance against Nancy Guthrie? Who did this retired university worker, this widow, this grandmother who went to church and played cards and watched the javelina eat her plants in the Catalina foothills? Who did she wrong? Who did she threaten? Or who did she take something from? The answer, after 23 days of active federal investigation, after the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department canvassed her neighborhood, reviewed her history, interviewed her colleagues, and followed every thread available to them. The answer is nobody. Not one credible report of conflict. not one person who came forward with a documented grievance against Nancy Guthrie. In 17 years at the University of Arizona, she was described by a retired vice provost named Elizabeth Irvin as someone who was overwhelmingly positive and gracious. The sheriff called her sharp as a tack. Her church called her a revered member of the community. Nobody had a reason. But here is where the forensic picture gets precise. Because the crime committed against Nancy Guthrie was not built around her life at all, and it was built around the details of someone else's. The bloodstains found at her home were confirmed to be hers. The ransom demand was not calibrated to Nancy's modest retirement income. It was calibrated to her daughter's salary. The timing was not built around Nancy's schedule. It was built around Savannah's. The media strategy, sending demands to a television station, to TMZ, was not designed to reach a retired university clerk. It was designed to reach a national audience that knew Savannah Guthrie's face. Every element of this crime points in the same direction, away from Nancy, and toward the 20 years of power her daughter built, while her mother lived quietly in the desert. Nancy Guthrie needed daily medication to manage chronic pain. Without it, her family stated publicly, she would suffer. She had limited mobility. She could not walk unassisted for any significant distance. She had a pacemaker. She was, in the forensic language of criminal profiling, a low-risk victim in the most protected environment available to her, her own home of 50 years, in a neighborhood she had lived in since the early 1970s. And that is the detail that 4 independent FBI experts have all identified as the structural key to this entire case. When a low-risk victim in a low-risk environment becomes the target of a high-risk, carefully pre-planned operation, the motivation behind that operation has to be extraordinary. It has to be strong enough to override every rational calculation about risk. And the only motivation in this case that clears that bar, the only one that accounts for the ransom number, the timing, the media strategy, and the surveillance that began at least a week before February 1st, is a grievance that was never about Nancy at all. Someone used an 84-year-old woman as an instrument. They chose her precisely because she was vulnerable, because she was unprotected, because they knew that reaching her would reach Savannah in a way that nothing else could. And in the next chapter, the ransom demand itself is going to tell us exactly how much this person knew about Savannah Guthrie's life and how long they had been paying attention. On the morning of February 2nd, 2026, a KOLD News 13 anchor in Tucson opened an email. What was inside stopped the newsroom cold. It was a ransom demand. Specific, detailed, containing information about the interior of Nancy Guthrie's home that had not been released publicly. Information about the position of items inside the house, information about a broken floodlight on the property, information that, as KOLD anchor Mary Coleman stated on CNN's Aaron Burnett Out Front 2 days later, only someone who had been inside that house, or someone in direct contact with whoever had, could have known. The demand was for $4 million, payable in Bitcoin, sent to a specific wallet address, with a deadline attached. That same note, or a version of it, arrived at TMZ's tip line the same day. And the Pima County Sheriff's Department responded publicly within hours. Sheriff Chris Nenos stated directly that he was absolutely not dismissing the ransom communications. His office posted on social media that all tips and leads were going directly to detectives coordinating with the FBI. And within 24 hours, that initial demand of $4 million was being treated by law enforcement as a credible piece of evidence in an active federal investigation. Think about that word. Credible. Law enforcement does not apply that word to a ransom note out of courtesy. They apply it when the contents of that note contain verifiable details that the person writing it should not have been able to access without direct involvement in the crime. The position of an Apple Watch inside the house. A broken floodlight on the exterior of the property. These are not details a speculative letter writer assembles from news coverage. These are details that require presence, access, or a direct line to someone who had both. Now, here is where this case introduces its first false summit. Because when those initial ransom communications surfaced, the investigation appeared to snap into focus. There was a demand. There was a deadline. There was a wallet address. There was, seemingly, a clear transactional framework. Pay the money. Get Nancy back. The kind of structure that, however grim, at least suggests a path forward. That structure collapsed almost immediately. By February 6th, a second note arrived through KOLD's anonymous tip line, different in tone from the first. And then, on February 9th, the demand escalated, and the figure in the updated ransom communication rose from $4 million to $6 million. A new deadline was set. 5 p.m. on Monday, February 9th, local Tucson time. The Guthrie family responded publicly over that weekend. Savannah Guthrie, alongside her sister Annie and brother Cameron, posted a video to Instagram. They stated directly that they had received the message, that they understood, and that they would pay. Savannah's words in that video were measured and deliberate. She said they begged for their mother's return, that paying was something they were prepared to do, that this was the only way they would have peace. By Monday evening, the 5 p.m. deadline passed. TMZ confirmed publicly that the Bitcoin wallet address associated with the demand registered a balance of 0. No transaction, no transfer, no contact from whoever had sent the notes. The deadline came and went, and Nancy Guthrie was still missing. Ask yourself what that silence means, because it tells you something critical about the nature of this operation. A professional ransom demand has a clear architecture. You make contact privately. You establish proof of life. You negotiate terms. You collect payment. You fulfill the exchange. That is the transactional logic of financial extortion. But nothing about this case followed that architecture. The demands went to a television station and a celebrity news outlet, not to the family's private channels. There was no proof of life provided at any point, despite the family publicly requesting it. The deadline passed without any follow-up contact from whoever sent the notes. The wallet sat empty. And when investigators detained a 36-year-old Arizona man, identified publicly only by his first name, Carlos, and held him briefly as a person of interest, the case appeared for one night to be approaching resolution. A suspect, a lead, a face attached to the investigation. America's Most Wanted co-host Callahan Walsh, monitoring the case in real time, said publicly that he genuinely expected to wake up the following morning with positive news. He did not. Carlos was released the following day. He told reporters he did not know who Nancy Guthrie was and hoped the real perpetrator could be found. The investigation, in Walsh's own words, appeared to be back to square one. That pattern, a lead that surfaces, charges the investigation with energy, and then dissolves, is the forensic signature of a case where the surface evidence and the actual evidence are pointing in different directions. Now, look at the ransom itself, not the mechanics of it, the math of it. Nancy Guthrie was a retired university worker. She owned a modest home in the Catalina foothills. She drove a standard vehicle. She had no significant investment portfolio, no business assets, no public financial profile of any kind. A ransom demand directed at Nancy Guthrie's own resources would have been a fraction of $6 million. Investigators and financial analysts covering this case noted this discrepancy immediately. The $6 million figure has no relationship to Nancy's financial reality. It has a very specific relationship to someone else's. Savannah Guthrie earns a documented annual salary of between $8 million and $24 million. Her estimated net worth is approximately $40 million. $6 million represents a calculable percentage of Savannah's publicly available financial profile. It is the kind of figure that someone arrives at after studying salary reports, contract negotiations, and publicly available financial disclosures tied to Savannah's career. It is not a number pulled randomly. It is a number derived from research, from attention, from time spent inside the documented details of Savannah Guthrie's professional and financial life. The media targeting confirms the same conclusion. Ransom demands in financially motivated cases go to the people with the resources to pay. They go through private channels. They go to lawyers, to family members with direct access to funds, to intermediaries who can facilitate a quiet transfer. They do not go to TMZ. They do not go to the CBS affiliate in Tucson. They do not go to outlets whose entire operational purpose is to broadcast information to the widest possible audience. Unless broadcasting is the point. Unless the goal is not quiet extraction, but public exposure. Unless what the person who sent those notes wanted, more than the money itself, was for Savannah Guthrie to have to sit in front of a camera on the network her career was built on and talk about her missing mother on national television. Because that is exactly what happened. Savannah Guthrie, one of the most composed and professional broadcasters in the country, returned to the Today Show and addressed her mother's disappearance on air. She did it while the investigation was active, while the ransom deadlines were passing, while the Bitcoin wallet sat at zero. The cruelty of that public exposure was not incidental to the design of this operation. It was, according to every behavioral expert who has examined the structure of this case, the design itself. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you are watching this case develop in real time the way we are, tell us, what is the one detail in this ransom timeline that stands out most to you? The ransom notes also contained one additional detail that the FBI has not dismissed and has not confirmed. The notes referenced specific damage to a fixture at the exterior of Nancy's property. A detail that required either physical presence at that property or direct knowledge from someone who had been there. Law enforcement's own credibility assessment of the notes rested partly on that detail, which means the person who wrote those notes was not operating from a distance. They were operating from proximity, from knowledge that was earned, not assumed. And that proximity is the thread that connects the ransom communications directly back to the behavioral conclusion that Johnny Grusing reached from the doorbell footage. Personal, specific, pre-planned, built on access that a stranger does not have, and a grievance that financial calculation alone cannot explain. The $6 million may never have been the real point. The real point may have been the $6 million ask appearing on every screen in America. On Savannah's screen, on the screen of every person who has spent 2 decades watching her anchor a morning show and wondering, in the specific way that Grievance calculates these things, what it would take to make her feel what they feel. In the next chapter, we are going to map the full architecture of Savannah Guthrie's 20-year career. The power she accumulated, the people she crossed, and the specific categories of enemy that career produced. Because one of those categories sent those ransom notes to a television station instead of a lawyer. And the FBI knows exactly why. To understand who had a grievance strong enough to go to East Kleinedale Road at 2 in the morning, you first have to understand exactly what Savannah Guthrie built. Not the version of it that appears in promotional materials, the full architecture, the power, or the money, the enemies that architecture produces by design, not by accident. Savannah Clark Guthrie was born on December 27, 1971, in Melbourne, Australia, the daughter of a mining engineer and a woman who would later structure her own professional life entirely around her children's futures. The family settled in Tucson in the early 1970s, and Savannah grew up in the Catalina foothills, the same neighborhood where her mother would live for the rest of her life. She attended the University of Arizona. She started in broadcasting at KTVM, the NBC affiliate in Butte, Montana, in October 1993. On her 10th day at the station, the local news operation closed. That is where most careers end. Savannah Guthrie's was just beginning. She moved to ABC affiliate KMIZ in Columbia, Missouri, then back to Tucson at NBC affiliate KVOA, and then to WRC-TV in Washington, D.C., where she covered the September 11th attack on the Pentagon and the 2001 anthrax attacks. Then, while working as a broadcast journalist, she made a decision that separated her from every other anchor in her tier. She went back to school. She enrolled at Georgetown University Law Center. She graduated magna cum laude in 2002. She scored first place on the Arizona bar exam. She is a licensed attorney in both Arizona and Washington, D.C. That combination, the legal precision of a magna cum laude Georgetown law graduate layered on top of the on-camera instincts of a working journalist, is not common in American television. It is, in the specific context of the interview chair, a formidable instrument. And it is the instrument that Savannah Guthrie carried into NBC News in September 2007. Through the White House correspondent role she held from 2008 to 2011, and into the co-anchor chair she has occupied at The Today Show since July 2012. She replaced Ann Curry. She built the show's first 2 hours into a franchise that generated nearly $203.5 million in advertising revenue in 2025 alone. Her annual salary sits between $8 million and $24 million. Her estimated net worth is $40 million. She married Michael Feldman in March 2014 in Tucson, a founding partner of Glover Park Group, a major Washington, D.C. communications and consulting firm with deep roots in the Clinton-Gore White House. Together, they operate at an intersection that most people never reach: media, politics, law, money, influence. Intersections like that do not come without friction. They do not come without people who feel displaced, outmaneuvered, publicly humiliated, or professionally destroyed by the decisions made at the top. And Savannah Guthrie has been at the top of that intersection for over a decade. Now consider the specific categories of friction her career has generated. Because the FBI's behavioral unit does not look for enemies in the abstract. They look for documented categories of conflict. They map professional histories. They cross-reference grievance patterns against the forensic profile of the crime. And the documented history of Savannah Guthrie's career produces several categories that would demand immediate investigative attention. The interview chair is the first category. In her role at Today and across NBC platforms, Savannah has conducted adversarial interviews with some of the most powerful and some of the most volatile personalities in the country. She interviewed Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama. She held the interview chair through the most divisive political period in modern American media history. And she did it with a specific quality that makes her particularly effective and, to the person on the receiving end of it, particularly confrontational. She follows up. She does not let subjects redirect. She does not soften the question when the answer is evasive. In media language, That quality is called tenacity. To the person who watched their reputation collapse in a 7-minute segment in front of 4 million viewers, that quality has a different name. In October 2020, a Savannah moderated a live town hall with then-President Donald Trump. A broadcast NBC made the controversial decision to schedule opposite a simultaneous event by Democratic candidate Joe Biden on ABC. Savannah kept the proceedings tightly managed. When Trump attempted to redirect a question about a conspiracy theory he had recently amplified on social media, Savannah said directly on air, "You are the president. You are not like somebody's crazy uncle who can retweet whatever." That exchange generated millions of views and a sustained wave of public backlash directed specifically at Savannah. The volume of documented negative attention directed at her following that single broadcast was among the highest of her career. The second category is the professional ecosystem inside NBC itself. Television is a zero-sum industry. Every salary negotiation Savannah wins restructures the financial hierarchy of the entire morning television market. Every exclusive interview she lands is an exclusive someone else did not get. Every hour she occupies the co-anchor chair is an hour an ambitious producer, an emerging correspondent, or a waiting colleague did not get. The Today Show's first 2 hours alone, the hours Savannah anchors, are worth over $200 million annually in advertising. That kind of revenue concentration creates professional stakes that most workplaces never reach. And in March 2026, a Daily Mail investigation reported that multiple NBC insiders, speaking on condition of anonymity, described a workplace culture inside the Today Show that one source called a viper's nest. The same investigation reported that many staffers privately hoped Savannah would not return to the show following her mother's disappearance, citing the professional opportunities created by her extended absence. Another source described the internal environment as a place where people will steal your chair while you are still sitting in it. These are not the descriptions of a workplace without conflict. These are the descriptions of a high-stakes professional environment where careers are built and ended in proximity to one of the most powerful anchors in morning television. Now add one more detail to that picture. On January 5th, 2026, just 26 days before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, Savannah underwent surgery on her vocal cords to remove nodules and a polyp. She had been absent from the Today Show for several weeks recovering. She returned to the air in late January 2026 and announced she was feeling better. She was scheduled to host the 2026 Winter Olympics opening ceremony at San Siro Stadium in Milan alongside broadcaster Terry Gannon and snowboarder Shaun White. It was one of the most high-profile broadcasting assignments of her career. The timing of Nancy's disappearance did not just interrupt Savannah's professional life. It detonated it at its highest point. She stepped away from the Olympics. She stepped away from the show. She went to Tucson and stayed. Someone knew that timing. Someone knew the surgery. Someone knew the Olympics schedule. Someone knew that January 31st, 2026, was the specific window in which Savannah Guthrie would be at her most professionally exposed, her most publicly visible, and her furthest from the quiet residential street in the Catalina foothills, where her mother lived alone. What time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. And while you are there, tell us which category of Savannah's enemy engine you think investigators are focused on most, because the next chapter is where this case gets specifically forensically dangerous. And it starts with the night that changed NBC forever. And in the next chapter, a single firing at NBC, announced live on national television by Savannah Guthrie herself, produced a professional earthquake whose aftershocks are still being felt inside that building, and whose debris field includes people who have never stopped blaming her for what came next. It was 7 a.m. on Wednesday, November 29, 2017. 45 million Americans had their televisions tuned to the Today Show. And Savannah Guthrie sat at the anchor desk, without her co-host, and delivered 3 words that detonated across the entire American media landscape before the first commercial break. Matt Lauer terminated. She had been woken before dawn with the news. She had no script for it. She had no preparation for the specific cruelty of being asked to announce live on national television in front of millions of people that her co-anchor of 5 years, the man she had called her dear friend, her partner, the person she sat beside every single morning, was gone. Fired overnight. And she had to deliver that information to America before she had fully processed it herself. She did it with composure. She fought back tears. She read NBC News Chairman Andrew Lack's official statement. She said they were devastated. She said she was heartbroken for her friend Matt and for the colleague who had come forward. And then she said something that would be dissected, analyzed, and weaponized against her from 2 completely opposite directions simultaneously. She said, "How do you reconcile your love for someone with the revelation that they have behaved badly?" That single question, honest, raw, and live on national television, made Savannah Guthrie the target of 2 incompatible camps of public fury at the exact same moment. One side said she was not condemning Lauer forcefully enough, and that her grief for her friend overshadowed her support for the women who had come forward, that her devastation was performed. The other side said she had participated in his destruction, that she had benefited from his removal, that the woman who sat beside him every morning for 5 years could not possibly have known nothing. She was criticized from both directions simultaneously, publicly, relentlessly, for weeks. Now hold that and add what happened next inside NBC. Because the professional consequences of Lauer's termination were not limited to the anchor desk. Matt Lauer had been the highest-paid person at NBC News, earning over $20 million annually. He was, as one NBC executive described him at the time, the economic engine that propels NBC's news division. His departure did not just remove a co-anchor, it restructured the financial and professional hierarchy of the most profitable franchise in morning television. Positions shifted, budgets moved, influence redistributed. And the person who emerged at the highest point of that restructured hierarchy was the woman who had announced his termination live on air. Hoda Kotb stepped into the co-anchor role alongside Savannah on a temporary basis in December 2017. She was formally elevated to permanent co-anchor in January 2018. The Today Show continued. The advertising revenue continued, and Savannah Guthrie, who had been Lauer's co-anchor, became the dominant voice of the franchise that his departure had left exposed. To some, that trajectory was the natural continuation of a career built on merit. To others, inside the building and outside of it, it looked like something else. The professional earthquake that Lauer's termination caused produced collateral damage across an entire network. Producers who had aligned themselves with Lauer's era, correspondents who had operated inside the professional ecosystem he anchored, staffers whose career trajectories had been shaped by the structure of a franchise that Lauer had led for 2 decades. When that structure collapsed, the debris fell unevenly, and Savannah Guthrie was standing at the top of what was left. Grievance does not always announce itself. It does not always surface in a threatening letter or a confrontational encounter. Sometimes it goes quiet. Sometimes it settles into the professional landscape of a person's daily life and calcifies there slowly over months and years, until it becomes something that a 25-year FBI behavioral analyst would recognize immediately as the specific psychological architecture of a personal operation. Now add the detail that makes the timing of this case almost impossible to treat as coincidental. In January 2026, the same month Nancy Guthrie disappeared, Brooke Nevels, the NBC producer whose complaint had directly led to Lauer's termination in 2017, published her memoir. It was titled Unspeakable Things. An excerpt, published by New York Magazine's The Cut in January 2026, detailed both the original incident and its brutal professional aftermath for Nevels herself. The book reignited the entire Lauer conversation at NBC. It put the 2017 termination back on the front page. It put Savannah's name back in those articles, because Savannah was the anchor who had announced the firing, the anchor who had navigated the fallout, the anchor who had survived and risen, while others around her had not. The Nevels memoir landed in January 2026. Nancy Guthrie disappeared on February 1st, 2026. 13 days separated those two events. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit does not treat timing as coincidence. It treats timing as evidence. The resurgence of the Lauer story, the reactivation of old grievances inside NBC's professional ecosystem, the reigniting of public debate about who knew what and who benefited, all of it landed in the precise window of weeks before someone went to the Catalina foothills with a prop firearm and knocked on an 84-year-old woman's door. This is not an accusation directed at any individual. The FBI has ruled out all immediate family members and their spouses as suspects. What it is a documented factual sequence that the behavioral science of this case demands be examined. A professional earthquake in 2017, a memoir that reopened it in January 2026, a criminal operation executed 13 days later, and at the center of all three events, the same name, the same anchor desk, the same woman who had to sit in front of a camera in November 2017 and tell America that her co-anchor was gone before she had finished processing it herself. The Matt Lauer earthquake did not end in 2017. It sent aftershocks into 2018, 2019, through the years that followed, and directly into January 2026. And somewhere in those aftershocks is a person whose grievance never cooled, and who, when that memoir landed and the old anger surfaced again, made a decision that investigators are still working backward from today. And in the next chapter, the political dimension of Savannah's career produces a category of enemy that the FBI's own documented threat files confirm reached a peak immediately after a single live television broadcast, and whose operational profile matches the forensic architecture of this case in ways the behavioral unit cannot ignore. October 15th, 2020. The Perez Art Museum in Miami, Florida. Savannah Guthrie sat across from the sitting President of the United States in front of a live audience, a national television feed, and approximately 13 million viewers. The town hall had been arranged at the last minute after the president withdrew from the second scheduled presidential debate. NBC made the decision to air it simultaneously opposite ABC's town hall with Joe Biden, a scheduling call that drew immediate criticism from inside the network itself, from journalism organizations, and from MSNBC anchor Rachel Maddow, who distanced her own network from the broadcast on air the same night it aired. Savannah moderated alone. No co-anchor, no buffer, just a Georgetown-trained attorney with a microphone, a live audience, and the most powerful elected official in the world sitting 3 feet across from her. Within the first 15 minutes, the broadcast became something American television had not seen in years. A sitting president, visibly uncomfortable, unable to redirect, unable to run out the clock with a friendly host who would let an evasion pass. When the president retweeted a conspiracy theory claiming the death of Osama bin Laden had been staged, Savannah pressed him directly on it. His answer was a shrug. She came back. When he refused to answer when he had last tested negative for the coronavirus before his diagnosis, she pressed again. He told her they were on the same side. She did not move. And when she looked at him and said, "You are the president. You are not like someone's crazy uncle who can just retweet whatever." The clip was on every platform in the country within the hour. The broadcast won an Emmy Award for Outstanding Live Interview. In journalism circles, it was widely described as one of the finest moments of Savannah Guthrie's career. The New York Times wrote that she managed to put the president on the spot and reveal his evasions in a way that few of his interlocutors had managed. The Washington Post said she grilled Trump like few others have. On the other side of that reaction, the backlash was immediate, organized, and sustained. Fox News host Sean Hannity said on air that same evening that what viewers witnessed was not journalism, calling it a political debate with the Today Show host serving as Biden's surrogate. Greg Gutfeld, also on Fox News, "I posted 12 separate public attacks on Savannah the night of the broadcast." Laura Ingraham said Savannah was debating, not interviewing. Fox contributor Katie Pavlich asked publicly whether it was a town hall or a debate between the president and Savannah Guthrie. Within 48 hours, a Change.org petition demanding Savannah's firing from NBC had gathered significant traction. The petition described her as loud, rude, offensive, and unprofessional. It called for a boycott of NBC and its sponsors. It stated directly that others had lost their jobs at the Today Show for doing far less. At a rally held after the broadcast, the former president described Savannah's performance from the stage. He called her, in his exact words, a crazed lunatic, rising out of her chair as she screamed questions. Now understand what that moment produced. And not in media terms, in behavioral terms. Because the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit does not measure public backlash by the number of tweets or the volume of cable news commentary. It measures it by the specific psychological architecture it leaves behind in the people who feel it most intensely. And the research on grievance-motivated action is precise about what that architecture looks like. The perpetrator does not need to be rational. They do not need to have been directly harmed. They need to believe they were wronged. They need to have processed a public event as a personal injury. They need to have spent enough time nursing that belief that it moved from emotion into something operational. Political loyalty is among the most powerful incubators of that process. When a person's political figure is publicly challenged, the loyalty that figure commands does not distinguish between a professional journalistic exchange and a personal attack. To millions of people watching that broadcast, Savannah Guthrie was not a journalist doing her job. She was an enemy. And enemies, in the specific grammar of grievance-motivated psychology, require a response proportional to the injury they caused. The Change.org petition was public. The Fox News attacks were public. But what the FBI has access to that the public does not are the private communications, the letters, the emails, the social media direct messages, the calls to NBC's switchboard. Every major television network maintains a threat file for its prominent anchors. These files are maintained not by choice, but by necessity. The volume of private communications that follow a broadcast like the October 2020 town hall, communications flagged by network security as concerning, as threatening, or as requiring law enforcement attention, would fill a substantial record. and the FBI requested Savannah Guthrie's full threat file within the first 48 hours of Nancy's disappearance. That file exists. It has names attached to it, and investigators are currently working through every name in it against the forensic and behavioral profile this case has produced. Here is the specific category of person that profile describes: someone with intense political conviction, someone who experienced the October 2020 broadcast not as a political event, but as a personal assault on something they held fundamental. Someone who, in the 5 years between that broadcast and February 1st, 2026, did not let it go, did not process it, did not move past it. Someone for whom Savannah Guthrie remained, across 5 years of daily life, a fixed object of a specific kind of anger. The kind that does not dissipate. The kind that waits for an opening. Political ecosystems breed a specific actor type that law enforcement and behavioral scientists have studied extensively. They are not always loud. They are not always the person sending threatening emails or showing up at public events. Sometimes they are quiet. Sometimes they are the person who sits with it for years and plans with a patience that only someone operating from a place of absolute personal conviction can sustain. And the forensic evidence in this case, the January 24th surveillance, the specific knowledge of Nancy's schedule, the calculations embedded in the ransom figure, the media strategy of the demand itself, describes someone who planned with exactly that kind of patience. What's the weather like where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. We want to know who is watching and from where. And while you are there, do you think the political enemy angle is the one investigators are most focused on? Because the next chapter takes this case in the direction that 4 FBI experts all pointed to independently. And it is the category of enemy that Savannah Guthrie has never met, has never spoken to, and may have no idea exists. In the next chapter, the FBI's documented profile of the obsessed individual, the category that former profiler Jim Fitzgerald named specifically in this case, shows us a pattern of behavior that the Bureau has tracked in cases like this one for decades. And the detail that makes it most relevant here is not how dangerous that profile can be. It is how invisible it remains until the moment it is not. On February 18, 2026, while former FBI profiler Jim Fitzgerald was live on Megyn Kelly's program, a piece of breaking evidence surfaced in real time on air that stopped the conversation cold. Investigators had detected a series of unusual Google searches originating from somewhere inside the state of Arizona. The searches were specific. They were not casual. Someone had been searching for Nancy Guthrie's home address. Someone had been searching for Savannah Guthrie's salary. Not once, not as a passing curiosity, repeatedly, with the kind of deliberate, targeted focus that behavioral analysts immediately recognize as the operational research phase of a pre-planned operation. Someone sat at a device in Arizona and typed those searches into a search engine. They wanted to know where Nancy lived. They wanted to know what Savannah earned. And those two pieces of information, the address of the most vulnerable person in Savannah's life and the financial profile of Savannah herself, are the precise two variables embedded in the architecture of this crime. Fitzgerald had described this behavioral pattern weeks earlier. He and his colleague, retired Special Agent Raymond Carr, had developed a formal profile of the masked individual seen in the surveillance images. Carr's assessment was direct. The suspect exhibited what Carr called fantasy-driven behavior. He would have conducted online research about surveillance systems, about restraints, about the property layout. He would have conducted dry runs, multiple trips to the Catalina foothills before February 1st, driving the routes, timing the distances, learning the rhythms of the neighborhood before he ever set foot on that porch. The January 24th surveillance footage request confirmed it. Someone was there a week before Nancy disappeared. Learning, mapping, preparing. Fitzgerald described a second behavioral signature that investigators are using to identify the suspect in the present tense. And the pressure of being under the microscope, Fitzgerald said, is causing the suspect to exhibit observable stress behaviors right now. Sleep disruption, potential changes in substance use, over-explaining his whereabouts to people around him, creating unsolicited alibis. The kind of behavioral tells that surface when someone is carrying knowledge they cannot share and fear they cannot suppress. Fitzgerald said directly, "If someone recognizes this behavior in a person they know, look at the video. Because the person investigators are looking for is not invisible. They are in someone's life. They are in someone's workplace. They are sitting across from someone at a table right now, and the people around them have noticed that something changed." Jim Clemente added the physical layer to that profile. And the suspect is probably in his 30s or 40s. He has some forensic awareness. He wore a mask, gloves, a full bodysuit over his clothing, and what may have been 2 layers of both the mask and gloves. He understood the concept of physical trace evidence, but his execution failed him in 3 specific places. He did not cover his mouth, which means that for the 41 minutes he was inside Nancy Guthrie's home, he was exhaling biological material into the interior environment of that residence. Clemente's exact framing was precise. He was breathing out DNA for 41 minutes in that house. His eyes, eyebrows, eyelashes, and part of his facial hair were exposed throughout. That material, microscopic, invisible to the naked eye, does not disappear. It settles, it waits, and inside a protected interior environment, to shield it from weather and contamination, it remains viable for forensic analysis long after the person who left it believed they had gotten away clean. And then there is the right wrist. In the surveillance images released by the FBI, Jim Clemente identified what appears to be a marking on the underside of the suspect's right wrist, visible in at least one frame where the glove shifted position. Clemente said that marking, consistent with a tattoo, could allow investigators to rule in and rule out potential suspects with precision. A tattoo on a specific location of the body is not a general descriptor. It is an identifier. It narrows a field. It takes a pool of potential subjects and compresses it. And combined with the biological material left inside that residence, it represents the kind of physical evidence that cases like this one are ultimately broken by. Less than 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, investigators recovered what appeared to be a black glove. Consistent in color and style with the gloves visible in the surveillance footage. Its exact evidentiary value has not been confirmed publicly. But law enforcement does not document and photograph a piece of recovered material without a reason. Now set all of that physical evidence alongside the behavioral profile that Jim Clemente constructed from the footage and the timeline. The suspect, Clemente said, is not a professional. He has some forensic awareness, but has not done this before. He is not military trained. He is not law enforcement trained. He is someone who prepared emotionally and intellectually for this operation, who researched it, who rehearsed it, who built it in his mind over an extended period of time, but who, when the moment arrived, made the specific errors that first-time offenders make. See, he underestimated the camera. He did not cover his mouth. He revealed a potential identifying mark on his wrist. He left biological traces at the scene. He spent 41 minutes inside a residence he had planned to exit far sooner. Clemente introduced a framework that reorients the entire motivational structure of this case. He said the offender's behavior shows a fixation on the Guthrie family that goes beyond financial calculation. Getting an emotional reaction from Savannah Guthrie, Clemente said, may have been sufficient for the offender's goals. The ransom may have been, in behavioral terms, a performance, a mechanism for inserting himself into Savannah's public life, for forcing a woman with 4 million daily viewers to acknowledge his existence, his grievance, his power over something she loved. And he also introduced a specific subcategory of fixated individual that the FBI's behavioral unit has studied extensively. He called them automatic stalkers, individuals who feel a deep personal connection to a public figure that exists entirely within their own psychological framework. The public figure does not know them, has never met them. But inside the stalker's internal world, the relationship is real, specific, and reciprocal. When that perceived relationship is threatened, or when the stalker believes it has been denied, violated, or ignored, the response can escalate from passive fixation to active operation. The target of that operation is rarely the public figure directly. Public figures have security, visibility, and resources. The target is the person closest to them, the person most accessible, the person who, when taken, guarantees the emotional response the fixated individual has been seeking all along. Nancy Guthrie was accessible. She lived alone. She had a predictable schedule. She had a security system without a storage subscription. She had a garage door that opened at 9:48 on a Friday night and a porch that the right person could reach at 2 in the morning without anyone on that street noticing until it was already over. The most dangerous person on Savannah Guthrie's enemy list may be someone Savannah has never spoken to. Someone she has never been in the same room with. Someone who built an entire architecture of grievance from the outside looking in. From a television screen, from a search engine, from a parked car on a residential street in the Catalina foothills on the night of January 24th, 1 week before he came back and knocked on the door. And in the next chapter, all 4 named experts converge on a single composite profile. And the forensic and behavioral evidence they have each identified independently points, with a precision this investigation has not seen publicly assembled until now, toward one direction: 4 independent experts, 4 separate analyses, 4 professional careers built on the forensic science of understanding why human beings commit acts of violence against other human beings. And when you lay their conclusions side by side, the behavioral profile, the physical evidence, the timeline reconstruction, the motivational framework, they do not contradict each other. They stack, they converge, they build, layer by layer, into a single composite picture of an operation that was personal. So pre-planned and executed by someone who was not working alone. That last detail is new, and it changes everything about the physical architecture of this crime. The security gate at the front entrance of Nancy Guthrie's Catalina Foothills property is not a standard residential feature. It is a reinforced perimeter gate. Law enforcement experts examining the property layout have concluded that breaking through it from the outside would have been, in their assessment, nearly impossible. Yet Nancy Guthrie was removed from that property. The masked individual captured in surveillance footage was outside, on the porch, at the front door, interfering with the camera. Which means, if the gate cannot be breached from the outside, but the access point that allowed Nancy to be moved out through the front of the property had to come from the interior. The working theory that investigators have now developed is direct. A second individual was already inside the home when the masked figure appeared on the front porch. The person outside was not the entry point. He was the exit coordinator. He was there to receive Nancy and move her out once someone already inside had completed whatever they came there to do. 2 suspects, 1 operation, 1 inside, 1 outside. coordinated, timed, pre-planned across multiple visits to a neighborhood that investigators now believe was under active surveillance from at least January 11, 2026, 3 weeks before Nancy disappeared. The FBI has been asking neighbors for footage from January 11th in addition to January 24th. And they have been asking about a vacant property nearby that investigators believe may have been used as a staging location, a cover for monitoring the neighborhood's routines, its rhythms, the comings and goings of the people who lived there before the operation was executed. They have been asking about former neighbors who moved out shortly before Nancy disappeared. They have been asking for the names of every contractor who worked on a house under construction in the area. This is not the investigative footprint of a case with no leads. This is the investigative footprint of a case where investigators are building an architecture of access. They are mapping everyone who had a legitimate reason to be in that neighborhood in the weeks before February 1st. Everyone who could have observed the property without triggering suspicion. See everyone who might have seen the security gate, learned the schedule, timed the window, and then gone back twice more before the night of the operation. Now set that two-suspect framework against what the physical evidence has produced. Additional surveillance cameras at Nancy's property. One mounted on a fence capturing the rear of the house, one focused on the driveway and the garage door, captured something investigators have spent weeks analyzing. Family members, landscapers, pool workers, all documented on camera in the weeks before Nancy disappeared. All people who had legitimate access to that property. All people whose presence on the footage requires investigators to work backward through every visit, every face, every date, and ask the same question for each one. Was this person there for the reason they appeared to be there? And the physical description of the masked suspect has also sharpened since the initial FBI release. Beyond the dark clothing, the gloves, the backpack, investigators were able to establish additional details from the footage. The suspect had a black mustache, average build. He was carrying a 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack, a specific, identifiable product. And on the underside of his right wrist, in at least one frame where the glove shifted, there appears to be a marking consistent with a tattoo. Former FBI profiler Jim Clemente identified that detail specifically. A tattoo at that precise location on the body is not a general descriptor. It is an identifier. Combined with the partial facial hair visible below the mask, it compresses the field of potential subjects with a precision that general physical descriptors alone cannot achieve. And the DNA evidence is where this investigation may ultimately be decided. Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed publicly that biological material recovered from the scene is mixed, meaning it contains genetic material from more than one individual. That mixture has complicated the analysis timeline. The laboratory processing required to separate, sequence, and identify the individual contributors to a mixed DNA sample is methodical work. It cannot be rushed without compromising the integrity of the result. And the result, when it arrives, will be compared against every individual whose legitimate presence at that property can be documented. Against every contractor, every pool worker, every landscaper, every person who walked through that gate in the weeks before February 1st. Genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, one of the country's leading experts in forensic DNA analysis, weighed in directly on the case. She said she would return to that house and re-swab it entirely, searching specifically for what she called a rootless hair, a single strand, without a follicle, invisible to the naked eye. Forensically sufficient to build a DNA profile through the genealogical techniques that have broken cases closed for decades. Moore's exact framing was direct. These cases can be solved with just a rootless hair. The techniques now exist. The question is not whether the evidence is there. The question is how long the laboratory analysis takes. Former FBI Supervisory Special Agent Lance Leasing offered a measured assessment of where the investigation stands as it entered its 7th week. He told CBS News that the extended timeline without a named suspect points to a lack of meaningful leads entering the active phase of the investigation. He said it becomes much harder to keep an investigation current when the initial surge of tips has tapered and the forensic analysis is still running its course. But he added something that the family and the public needs to hold. He said he wanted to be hopeful that the silence from law enforcement was because they were onto something, that the absence of public communication was not the absence of progress, that somewhere in the forensic evidence, the surveillance analysis, the DNA laboratory, or the contractor lists, a thread was tightening. Attorney Chad Cummings introduced a framework that the investigative record requires us to name honestly. He outlined 3 scenarios. Since the first, the FBI has already identified a suspect and is building the evidentiary case in silence to avoid alerting that individual before an arrest can be executed. The second, the investigation has encountered institutional friction of a nature that is slowing the path to a public result. The third, investigators are further from a resolution than the public communications suggest. Cummings himself stated he believed the first scenario was the most likely. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer went further. She said that law enforcement's refusal to accept help from specialist civilian search groups, a decision that in standard missing persons cases would be unusual, may indicate that investigators are further forward than they have publicly revealed. Would that they are in a phase of the investigation where outside access to the search area could compromise evidence or alert a subject. Sheriff Chris Nanos said something publicly in the weeks following Nancy's disappearance that has not received the attention it deserves. He said from day one they had strong beliefs about what happened, and those beliefs had not diminished. He did not say they were searching blindly. He did not say the evidence was insufficient. He said the beliefs formed in the first 24 hours of this investigation remained intact. That is the statement of an investigator who knows something, not everything, but something specific. Something that points in a direction the public record has not yet fully confirmed. And in the final chapter, everything this documentary has built, the timestamps, the experts, the enemy categories, the forensic evidence, the 2 suspect theory, the DNA in the laboratory, comes together in the one place the entire investigation has always pointed. Not toward a random stranger, not toward a professional operation, toward someone inside the orbit of Savannah Guthrie's life. Someone who planned, someone who waited, someone who is, right now, in someone else's daily life, and whose behavior, according to Jim Fitzgerald, has already started to change. As of today, March 22, 2026, Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 50 days. 50 days. 1,200 hours. 72,000 minutes since Tommaso Cioni watched a garage door close behind his mother-in-law on a quiet street in the Catalina foothills and drove home. Since a family went to bed, believing the person they loved most was safe inside the house she had lived in for 50 years. Since whatever happened on that porch in the early hours of February first changed everything. The news vans are gone from the street outside her home. The orange cones have replaced them. Parking restrictions extend half a mile in every direction. A sign staked in the front garden reads, "This neighborhood needs space to process, heal, and gather in privacy." The yellow flowers and handwritten notes have accumulated at the property line, left by strangers who drove to the Catalina foothills because they could not think of anything else to do. Tucson artist Donna Preuss has been leaving canvas paintings outside the house. One of them reads, "Nancy, All of us are praying for you to come home now. Inside the investigation, the pace looks different from the outside than it does from the inside. Let us be precise about what is actually happening. A 20 to 24-person task force, split evenly between the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI's Phoenix Division, which operates a full field office in Tucson, is working this case every single day. The FBI's Phoenix field office has managed this investigation from the beginning and continues to do so. The Pima County Sheriff's Department issued a statement on March 13th confirming that investigators continue to analyze various forms of evidence, including material from forensic laboratories and images and video captured by cameras. They declined to comment on the specifics or status of that analysis. The FBI, when approached by media outlets, said the same thing. The investigation is ongoing. That silence is not nothing. That silence is, in the assessment of former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer, potentially the most significant communication law enforcement has made in weeks. Coffindaffer said directly that the refusal to accept help from civilian specialist search groups, a decision that in standard missing persons cases would be unusual, may indicate that investigators are in a phase of the operation where outside access to the search area could compromise either physical evidence or alert a subject who has not yet been moved on. The silence may not be the absence of progress. It may be the perimeter of it. Sheriff Chris Nanos went on the Today Show on March 13th and said something that every person following this case needs to hold. When asked whether investigators believed they knew why Nancy Guthrie was taken, Nanos did not hedge. He did not deflect. He said directly, "We believe we know why he did this, and we believe that it was targeted." He then added something that stopped the anchor mid-breath. He said that when asked whether the suspect could strike again, his answer was, "Absolutely." Criminal minds are criminal minds. That statement tells you two things simultaneously. It tells you that investigators have not yet made an arrest, and it tells you that they believe the person they are looking for is still out there, capable, and has not been neutralized by the investigation's momentum. That is not the statement of a law enforcement agency that is simply running down leads. That is the statement of a law enforcement agency that knows something specific about who they are looking for and what that person is capable of, but has not yet crossed the threshold required to move. Now let us assemble everything this documentary has built, because the full picture, laid out in sequence, is more precise than any single chapter of it. Retired Pima County homicide detective Kurt Dabb stated publicly on March 19th that this operation required coordination. Based on the available evidence, Dabb assessed that there were likely 2 to 4 accomplices involved. Not one person acting alone. A coordinated operation. Multiple individuals. Multiple roles. Someone to survey. Someone to stage. Someone to disable. Someone to receive. The vacant property near Nancy's home that the FBI has been investigating as a potential staging location was not incidental to the operation. It was, in Dabb's framework, the operational base from which the coordination was managed. Former Pima County SWAT Commander Bob Krieger confirmed that the property, which became vacant before Nancy disappeared, could have provided cover for suspects to blend into the neighborhood and monitor its rhythms before the operation was executed. The Ozark Trail hiker pack backpack the masked suspect was carrying, a 25-liter black pack, may have been purchased at Walmart. The FBI has been working that purchase record. A specific, identifiable consumer product purchased at a retailer with documented transaction records is the kind of physical evidence thread that breaks cases. Not because it names someone immediately, because it narrows. And narrowing is what this investigation has been doing quietly, methodically, across 50 days of forensic laboratory work, surveillance analysis, tip processing, and contractor background review. Over 1,500 tips arrived after the family's $1 million reward announcement on February 24th, and the FBI has a $100,000 reward of its own still active. Every tip is being processed. Former FBI agent Ken Crow, who worked the 1993 World Trade Center bombing case, described the investigative discipline required to work a case of this complexity without public updates. He said the absence of public communication does not reflect the absence of activity. It reflects the opposite. The more sensitive and specific the evidence, the less law enforcement can say without compromising the path to an arrest. The DNA laboratory analysis is still running. The mixed biological material recovered from the scene, confirmed to contain genetic material from more than one individual, requires the kind of methodical separation and sequencing that cannot be compressed without compromising the result. A genetic genealogist, C.C. Moore, has stated that a single rootless hair recovered from inside that residence could be sufficient to build a genetic profile and run it through genealogical databases. The techniques exist. They have broken cases closed for decades. The question is the laboratory timeline. The possible tattoo on the underside of the suspect's right wrist. The black glove recovered less than 2 miles from the home. The partial facial hair visible below the mask. The Google searches from inside Arizona for Nancy's address and Savannah's salary. The surveillance footage from January 11th and January 24th. The vacant staging property. The mixed DNA. The Ozark Trail backpack. The ransom note containing non-public details about the interior of a private residence. These are not the scattered fragments of a case without direction. See, they are the components of a forensic architecture that a 20 to 24-person task force has been building for 50 days, quietly, with the specific patience that complex multi-suspect investigations require. And against all of that, there is a person, or a group of people, who went to the Catalina foothills at 2 in the morning because of a grievance. Not against a retired university worker who went to church and played cards with her grandchildren. Against her daughter. Against 20 years of television. Against a career built at the intersection of media, politics, law, and influence. Against the broadcasts that ended careers and the interviews that humiliated powerful people in front of millions. Against the professional earthquake of 2017, the political confrontation of 2020, the Neville's memoir of January 2026, or the specific psychology of someone who built a relationship with Savannah Guthrie entirely inside their own mind and decided that the only way to make her feel what they felt was to reach her through the person she loved most. Savannah Guthrie returned to New York City in mid-March. She went back to work. She went back to the anchor desk her career was built on and sat in it while her mother's case remained open and active and unresolved. The discipline that requires is not something most people could access. And in the Tucson community she left behind, the people who knew Nancy best have not stopped. The flowers are still being left. The canvases are still being painted. The streamers are still live streaming from the street corner, racking up thousands of views daily, keeping the story alive because they believe that visibility is the one tool the public holds that law enforcement does not. If you know something, anything, about what happened on East Kleinedale Road in the Catalina foothills in the early hours of February 1st, 2026, the FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. The Pima County Sheriff's Department tip line is 5-203-514-900. The family is offering $1 million for information leading to Nancy's recovery or an arrest. $1 million and the ability to be the person who brought an 84-year-old woman home. Nancy Guthrie spent 50 years in the same house. She went to church. She played cards with her grandchildren. She raised 3 children on a university clerk's salary after losing her husband at 46 and never stopped. She had no enemies, but her daughter did. See, and somewhere in the documented history of Savannah Guthrie's 20 years at the top of American media is the person, or the people, who looked at all of that and decided that the most effective way to reach Savannah was through the woman who raised her. The FBI knows what kind of person does that. They know what the profile looks like. They know what the behavioral signatures are. And according to Jim Fitzgerald, that person's behavior has already started to change. The pressure of being under a microscope does things to people. It disrupts sleep. It changes patterns. It causes over-explanation. It causes the kind of visible anxiety that the people around you start to notice, even when you say nothing. If someone in your life has been different since February 1st, 2026, if something shifted that you could not explain, if the behavior changed in ways that did not make sense until right now, look at the footage. Look at the FBI's images of that masked figure on the porch. Look at the black mustache, the backpack, the wrist, and call the number. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 50 days. The file is still open. The task force is still working. And somewhere out there, the answer already exists. It is just waiting to be found. If this documentary gave you something, a new detail, a new framework, a new way of understanding what happened in the Catalina foothills, then do one thing right now. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Share this video with one person who is following this case. Every view, every share, every comment keeps this story in front of the people who need to see it. Drop in the comments. Who do you think had the most to gain by going after Savannah through her mother? We read every single one. And we will be here with every verified update as this investigation moves forward. Nancy, we are still looking.